This is Ecuador, named for the equator, but its story begins in thin air under volcanoes. You might expect heat, low jungle, maybe a coastline. Instead, the capital sits high in the Andes. South of Quito, volcanic peaks rise over farms, turning beauty and risk into the same landscape. Turn east and the road drops fast until cloud forest starts swallowing the light between the mountains. Keep descending and pavement begins to lose authority. In parts of the Amazon, rivers become the real routes. Turn west instead, and Ecuador becomes humid Pacific ports, fishing boats, and coastal rhythms outsiders rarely picture. And far offshore waits the Galápagos, the image many people start with, but the last place this story should begin. Only now does the Ecuador map appear, and the small outline starts to look less simple. The mistake is reading Ecuador only sideways, as if distance across the page explains the country. But Ecuador is vertical. Elevation changes climate, food, movement, and identity faster than latitude can explain. One of South America's smaller countries contains one of the continent's most compressed ranges of worlds. The equator gives Ecuador its name, but it does not give the country its daily logic. The stronger force is altitude. Cold mornings, steep streets, volcanic soil, sudden descents, and air that changes with height. This is why Ecuador geography can feel counterintuitive before it feels familiar. The map is not wrong, it is incomplete. It flattens a country that is constantly asking to be read in layers. Those layers are not just landscapes. They decide where cities grow, where crops survive, how roads climb, and where water gathers. In the highlands, volcanoes are not background scenery. They help create fertile slopes while reminding people that the ground is alive. Lower down, cloud forest becomes a hinge between worlds, a green threshold most maps can barely communicate. Below that, the Amazon reorganizes movement. A line on the map becomes a river bend, a landing, a community edge. On the coast, another Ecuador appears, warmer, saltier, tied to ports, seafood, mangroves, and Pacific trade. Then the country continues beyond the mainland, carrying its identity into islands shaped by isolation and ocean currents. That is why the Galapagos will come later. First, the mainland has to teach us what Ecuador actually is. The real question is not how one country contains so many places. It shows how one small outline, traced on a map or a border, can carry so many rules. Each region changes the meaning of the last. Mountain air, volcanic water, forest descent, river movement, ocean life. So this Ecuador documentary begins by mistrusting the easiest image, even the one printed in the country's name. Because if the equator is the first fact you learn, it may also be the first fact you have to set aside. But the contradiction begins in a specific place. To understand how the equator's namesake country starts in cold air, you have to go to Quito. The equator's namesake capital does not feel tropical. Quito begins in thin mountain air surrounded by walls of rock. Among the world's highest official capitals, Quito sits at about 2,150 metres, where altitude becomes the first fact the body notices. The map says equator, but the elevation line tells a different story. This capital is lifted far above the tropics. Quito sits in a long Andean basin, pressed between ridges, ravines, and the volcanic horizons that frame daily life. That basin was not just scenic, it helped decide where the city could grow, defend itself, and drain water. Ridges offered protection, slopes moved rain away, and highland routes converged here before the city became a capital. So Quito's beauty is also a geographic decision, built inside a narrow mountain constraint rather than open tropical lowland. On the street, altitude turns geography into something ordinary. A walk uphill becomes a negotiation with lungs and pace. The sun can feel sharp on one block, then a shaded corner suddenly feels cold enough to change your rhythm. This is why Quito, Ecuador, unsettles the easy image of an equatorial country. Latitude promises heat, but elevation edits the promise. The same imaginary line that gives Ecuador its name explains less here than the vertical distance beneath your feet. Mornings arrive with jackets, clear light, and thin air that asks commuters, vendors, and visitors to slow down. Even public life adjusts, from the pace of walking to the simple choice of gathering where sunlight reaches the plaza. The historic centre is famous for churches and plazas, but terrain is the hidden architect underneath the beauty. Its colonial streets bend around hills and ravines instead of spreading across open flatland like a warmer coastal city. Earthquake risk and mountain topography encourage lower, solid forms, compact blocks, and a city that feels anchored to the basin. What looks preserved as heritage also records adaptation to a restless Andean setting, where stone, slope, and risk all matter. Quito is not flat enough to be understood from a single viewpoint. The city keeps changing as it climbs. Neighbourhoods climb and drop, creating small changes in temperature, light, views, and the daily effort of moving through the city. A short ride can shift the city from dense historic streets to high slopes, open sky, and colder wind. Altitude becomes an urban organizer, dividing views, routines, and even the feeling of distance inside one Ecuador capital. Markets make the same point without a diagram. Daily food here reflects a city shaped by cool elevation. Highland produce, warm meals, and morning trade make more sense in Quito's air than the word equator might suggest. This is food as geography, not a menu of things to try. The climate tells you why it belongs. Potatoes, grains, soups, and highland staples fit a capital where nights cool quickly, and mornings often begin under mist. As Ecuador's capital, Quito is modern, busy, and connected, but the mountain logic never disappears behind the traffic. Look outward from Quito, and the city seems less like a destination than a platform for understanding the entire country. From here, Ecuador's vertical story can finally begin to move, higher into volcano country, then downward toward forest and rivers. North and south, volcanoes rise beyond the basin like the next layer of the country waiting behind the capital. They are not only background scenery, they shape water, soil, farming, roots, risk, and the choices of entire valleys. But Quito is only the beginning of Ecuador's altitude story. South of the capital, the land rises into a corridor of volcanoes. What happens when the peaks that feed the farmland also threaten the people who depend on it? South of Quito, the Andes stop feeling like a backdrop and become a corridor of consequences, rising beyond the capital. Here, volcanoes are not just Ecuador's horizon, they are infrastructure, soil, water, roots, memory and risk in one system. On a flat map, this belt looks narrow. In real altitude, it becomes one of Ecuador's organizing systems stacked upward. This is the avenue of volcanoes, the highland spine where peaks rise over valleys people still work every day, despite the uncertainty. Cotopaxi often appears first in the imagination, symmetrical, snow-capped and close enough to make the capital feel watched from the south. But the spectacle is only the surface. The deeper story is what the volcanoes leave behind long after an eruption ends. Ash, lava, erosion, snowmelt and gravity have shaped valleys where water and fertility collect below the summits. The same forces that can break the landscape also help make volcanic soil Ecuador's highland engine, feeding fields beneath the peaks. That is the non-obvious bargain of the Andes. Danger helped create the ground people learn to depend on season after season. Potatoes, maize, beans, pasture and high-altitude crops are not random here. They follow elevation, moisture and soil chemistry. A farm on these slopes is not simply near a volcano, it is part of the volcano's afterlife, working with old ash. Look closely at the ground, and the postcard view becomes a working material. Dark, mineral, patient, and never completely stable. Water follows the same logic. Snow, ice, rain, and highland streams move downward through valleys and fields. For towns below, a peak can be a landmark, a reservoir and a warning all at once depending on the season. This is why highland settlement is rarely accidental. People gathered where roots, water, fields and safer slopes could meet. The crops on a market table later will begin here, in soil organised by altitude before commerce touches it. The contradiction is quiet until you see it from above. Beauty and exposure occupy the same frame in the highlands. A village may sit under a perfect cone because the land below it is useful, not because the view is romantic. Living with Ecuador volcanoes means reading the mountain as both provider and possibility, not as decoration on the horizon. Monitoring, memory, evacuation routes and local experience all become part of the highland system, folded into ordinary life. Cotopaxi's height is often given at nearly 5,900 meters, but the number matters less than the relationship. At that scale, a volcano alters weather, water, agriculture, and the way people imagine distance across the valley. The corridor south from Quito is therefore not a scenic detour. It is a map of dependence, drawn in ridges. Roads bend around ridges, towns cluster in basins, fields occupy the slopes where altitude still allows work. Then comes Chimborazo, where Ecuador's equator story returns in a stranger and more vertical form. Because Earth bulges at the equator, Chimborazo's summit is often cited as the point farthest from Earth's centre. The claim sounds like trivia, but it fits the larger lesson. Ecuador keeps hiding scale in the vertical dimension, not horizontal distance. Quilotoa offers another kind of proof, a crater lake where collapse, water and time produce stillness inside an old wound. The view is calm now, but its shape still records the force that carved it into the landscape we see today. In this chapter, the volcanoes have stopped being scenery. They have become an explanation for the highlands. They explain farms, water, roads, towns, and why highland life is built around a managed uncertainty. Follow the road away from the slopes, and the next system begins to appear in textiles, produce, and trade. Geology can tell you why people settled the highlands. It cannot tell you how identity moves through them. For that, the camera has to leave the summit line and enter the market towns. What can a highland market reveal about Ecuador that a volcano view cannot? A highland market can tell you more about Ecuador than a volcano view. The volcanoes explain why people settled the highlands. Markets explain how they stayed. In Otavalo, geography becomes visible one stall at a time. This is not simply a colourful stop in the mountains. It is a system of altitude, identity, and exchange. North of Quito, Otavalo sits inside the highland corridor, close enough to the capital to connect, but distinct enough to keep its own rhythm. Here, Quechua presence is not framed as something frozen in the past, but as part of everyday life in the streets and surrounding landscape. It operates through bargaining, production, family networks, and the daily commerce that fills streets, shops, and market stalls. Identity survives here partly because it is useful, visible, and active. It moves through language, clothing, trade, and the confidence of people running their own economy. What appears as visual abundance is also a practical map of what the highlands can produce. Potatoes, corn, grains, beans, and wool belong to a colder, higher Ecuador than the coast or the Amazon. Textiles matter here not only because they are beautiful, but because they shape the look and feel of the space around them. They are portable skill, regional memory, and work shaped by mountain climate. The market pulls together villages, farms, roads, and workshops that do not appear on a scenic postcard. Seeing only colour misses the point. The colour is the surface of a deeper exchange system. Tourism is part of the picture here, visible in the busy streets and visitor hubs, but it is not the whole picture. Otavalo was not invented for outsiders. Outsiders arrived at a market that already had logic. In that sense, Ecuador indigenous culture here is not preserved behind glass. It is negotiated in public in present tense through commerce. Food makes the altitude even clearer. A bowl built around potatoes, corn, grains, or highland vegetables carries the climate inside it. The same meal would make less sense on the humid Pacific coast, where seafood dominates daily cooking and fish markets shape the food culture. Or deep in the Amazon, where life along the river reshapes the pantry, from what people catch to what they can grow on the floodplain. That is why highland markets matter to this story. They turn Ecuador geography into something you can hold, cook, sell, and wear. The trade routes are modest on a national map, but they create a web of dependence between towns. A farmer, a weaver, a bus driver, a shopkeeper, and a buyer may all be participating in the same altitude economy. Even Ecuador's craft identity is easy to misread from outside. Some hats known internationally by another country's name have deep Ecuadorian roots. That small misreading echoes the larger one. Ecuador is often understood through the wrong entry point. The cloud forest is not a destination. It is the moment Ecuador changes form, halfway down the mountain. A few turns ago, the highlands were open, cold and dry. Now the same road enters wet green shadow. This is the midpoint of the country's vertical story, where altitude stops being background and starts changing the rules. On a flat map, this shift looks small. In the body, it feels like crossing into another climate system. West of Quito, around Mindo, the road drops from Andean Basin toward lower, warmer valleys and heavier air. Moisture rises from below, meets cooling mountain air, and condenses against the slopes as persistent cloud and mist. That collision creates a middle world, not highland, not Amazon, but cloud forest Ecuador, suspended between both. The crucial detail is precision. Cloud forests survive in altitude bands narrow enough that small climate changes matter. Move the temperature line or change the rhythm of rainfall, and the forest's ideal conditions can begin shifting uphill. That is why this landscape feels delicate, even when it looks overwhelming and endless from above. Every mossy branch is evidence of a climate system balanced on elevation, moisture, shade, and moving air. Ecuador biodiversity is often described in huge terms, but here the power is in compression and vertical layering. Birds, orchids, bromeliads, insects and trees occupy layers that change almost as quickly as the slope. The point is not the number of species, it is how many relationships depend on this narrow atmospheric hinge. The forest is built by weather, but organised by height. That is the hidden rule behind the green. The human geography changes with it. The highland market world gives way to another kind of local economy. Small farms, guest houses, conservation projects, and roadside stops all work inside this damp middle elevation zone. People here live between the mountain and the lowland, connected by roads that are always descending somewhere else. Even transport feels transitional. Vehicles follow curves that clouds seem to erase by afternoon. Around Mindo, Ecuador, the forest has become both habitat and livelihood, drawing visitors without becoming only scenery. Tourism can help make standing forest economically valuable, but it also brings pressure to the same fragile slopes. Agriculture, roads, and conservation meet here, not as abstract debates but as daily choices made along a hillside. The cloud forest forces a difficult question. How do you use a landscape without changing the conditions that create it? This is why the chapter matters in the larger film. Ecuador is no longer just stacked, it is changing. Quito's thin air, volcanic farms and highland markets now become the upper half of a national descent. The road turns geography into sequence. First the cold opens, then the light softens, then green closes in. Every bend subtracts altitude, and with it one version of Ecuador gives way to another version. Then, almost quietly, the cloud forest begins to loosen its grip. The slopes widen, the air grows heavier. Leaves grow larger, the road feels lower, and the mountains no longer dominate every horizon ahead. The next map reveal is not about height alone. It is about movement changing from road logic to river logic. Below the cloud forest, the descent continues. When the mountains finally release the road, pavement is no longer the answer. So what changes about daily life when rivers replace roads as the primary way to move? In this part of Ecuador, the river is the road, and the map stops behaving normally. Below the cloud forest, the mountains let go. The land flattens, widens, and begins to collect water. The road no longer promises arrival. It becomes a temporary edge beside a much older transport system. The Ecuadorian Amazon is not a distant wilderness outside the nation. It is one of Ecuador's operating systems. On a map, the east can look like green emptiness. In reality, it is organised territory. This is the chapter's real escalation. Ecuador stops being vertical and starts moving sideways inside the same national outline. At basin scale, movement changes the question. Not how far the road goes, but where the current can take you. Canoes become buses, delivery routes, school links, medical access, and family connections depending on the river. Distance here is measured less in kilometres than in water level, weather, daylight, and the patience of travel. A community may be close on the map and still feel far when river conditions shift or the river drops. That is the first reversal. Connection is not a line of asphalt, but a living surface that changes. Along the banks, daily routines gather where boats can land, gardens can hold, and people can watch the water. Fishing, small-scale agriculture, trade, school trips, and visits all bend toward the rhythm of the river. The river carries goods, but it also sets the calendar of errands, market days, and return trips. Homes, schools, small shops, and farms face the water because the water is the main street. This is still Ecuador, but it asks for different reflexes than Quito, Otavalo, or the volcanic highlands. In the highlands, altitude organised movement. Here water does, horizontally, persistently, and with fewer fixed edges. The same small country has shifted from switchbacks and steep streets to channels and boat landings in one descent. The map makes the distance look short. The lived transition is enormous between two worlds. On a flat map, a short line between places can hide a real shift in time, where the clock changes even though the distance looks minor. That is why the Ecuadorian Amazon is more than a landscape phrase for travellers or governments. The Amazon also complicates easy nature stories, because it is a political, economic and cultural landscape too. Oil, roads, protected areas and indigenous territories meet here in debates that reach far beyond the forest. Yasuni often becomes the symbol of this tension. Forest value, resource pressure, indigenous presence, and national policy in one place. But the point is not to reduce the rainforest to conflict. It is to see the system surrounding it. Communities here are not scenery around wilderness. They are part of Ecuador's present tense and future choices. Some govern territory, negotiate access, defend land, or work within economies shaped by decisions made far away. In the Ecuadorian Amazon, conservation is not separate from livelihood. Both occupy the same river system. That's the non-obvious truth. The Ecuadorian Amazon is connected, not detached from the rest of the country. Its rivers pull local life into national questions about energy, conservation, rights, transport and development for the entire country. Even silence on the water can be misleading. Beneath it are decisions made in capitals, communities and river towns. From Quito, the map can pivot east in a surprisingly small space, crossing from altitude into basin. Yet the change from mountain basin to river basin is not small at all. It rewrites movement completely. Now the map must pivot again, away from forest and towards salt air, harbours, and the busy edges of port cities. The Amazon is Ecuador turned sideways. Altitude stops leading the story and water takes over. But Ecuador has one more mainland world hidden in plain sight. The Pacific Coast outsiders rarely picture when they imagine Ecuador. Ecuador has a coast that its own global image seems to have forgotten. Ask someone to picture Ecuador, and almost no one begins with this: humid ports, fishing boats, seafood markets, and Pacific heat. Up to now, the country has changed by altitude, from mountains to cloud forest to Amazon rivers. But west of the Andes, the rules change again. The air thickens, the horizon opens, and Ecuador becomes maritime. On the map, the coast is not a thin border, it is an entire national world facing the ocean. That matters because Guayaquil, commonly counted as Ecuador's largest city by population, sits here, not in the highlands. The coast unsettles the outside image because it is central to Ecuador while somehow remaining peripheral in the imagination. The first rhythm is not resort life, it is work before the heat becomes heavy. These are working waters, boats leaving early, returning with the catch, and tying daily life to the Pacific. At the market, Ecuador seafood is not a culinary detail, it is geography arriving on tables before noon. Food here explains the coast faster than scenery can. Fish, shrimp, plantain, rice, and ocean-facing trade. On the northern coast, especially around Esmeraldas, Afro-Ecuadorian communities are part of the country's coastal identity. In Esmeraldas, music, food, family networks, and maritime labour carry histories that the mountain image cannot explain. Coastal culture is not a contrast to Ecuadorian identity. It is one of the ways that identity becomes complete. It changes the tempo: warmer air, lower elevation, wider streets, river mouths, estuaries, and a stronger pull toward the sea. Then Guayaquil shifts the scale from fishing rhythm to national system, because the coast is where Ecuador connects outward. Often counted as the country's largest city by population, Guayaquil makes the Pacific impossible to treat as a side note. Its ports turn Ecuador from a vertical country into a trading country, sending inland production toward ocean routes. Bananas, shrimp, cacao, and other exports move through coastal systems, linking farms, roads, rivers, ports, and ships. So the coast is not the edge of Ecuador. It is one of the places where the country becomes global. Even handmade craft carries this pattern of misrecognition, because the world sometimes names Ecuador's coastal work incorrectly. Monte Cristi, near the Pacific coast, is famous for fine woven hats the world often calls Panama hats. The name travelled differently from the craft, leaving Ecuadorian skill hidden behind another country's label. That misnaming matters because it mirrors the coast itself, present, influential, and often seen through the wrong frame. The ocean also edits identity here, shaping what people catch, grow, trade, and imagine beyond the shoreline. Cold influence from the Humboldt Current helps shape parts of Ecuador's Pacific ecology and fishing conditions. Boats follow water, markets follow boats, and coastal towns organise around a horizon the highlands never have. This is maritime Ecuador, not a beach appendix, but a working coastline with its own weather, food, labour and memory. Return to the map now, and the Pacific side no longer looks like an outline. It looks like a door. The country has already moved from thin air to volcanoes, markets, cloud forest, rivers, and now ocean. The coast answers the question the Amazon left behind. Ecuador's missing world was not empty, only overlooked. But the shoreline is not the end. It is the last mainland threshold before Ecuador leaves the continent. Far west, across open Pacific water, the map continues to the Galápagos, the place most outsiders start with, and this story reaches last. The Galápagos are not the introduction to Ecuador, they are its final argument. Most people begin here with animals and lava, but the islands only make sense after the mainland. The crossing is roughly 1,000 kilometers of Pacific water, enough distance to change almost every rule. Out here, Ecuador becomes less compact on the map and more complicated as a system. The first clue is geological. These islands are volcanic peaks rising from the ocean floor. They echo the mainland's volcanic story, but remove the farms, cities and mountain roads around it. What remains is creation exposed, black rock, thin soil and coastlines still shaped by eruption and erosion. But isolation alone does not explain the Galápagos. The ocean is doing just as much work. Cold water from the Humboldt Current meets warmer tropical influence near the islands, reshaping food, climate and life. That collision helps explain why the Galápagos feel so strange. They are tropical, but not simply lush. Wildlife here is often treated like spectacle, but the deeper story is adaptation under pressure. Marine iguanas, tortoises, birds and coastal life became unusual because the islands made ordinary survival difficult. Darwin visited in 1835, and the islands later helped change how people thought about evolution. But that visit was not the whole story. The important point is geography. Distance created separation, and separation created difference over time. The Galápagos are also not an untouched world floating outside the country. They are part of Ecuador. They are an Ecuadorian province with permanent residents, port towns, schools, supply chains, and local government. That reality matters because conservation here is not an abstract idea. People live inside the protected system. Food, fuel, building materials, visitors and rules all have to cross the same ocean gap. Movement is controlled because the stakes are unusually high. Every arrival can bring pressure, opportunity or risk. Tourism supports livelihoods, but it also has to be managed so the place that draws visitors is not damaged by them. That is the central tension of Galapagos conservation: Protection depends on regulation, but the islands also depend on connection. Park rules, guided routes, vessel controls and entry systems make the islands feel carefully watched. The result is not a simple paradise, it is a working experiment in limits. The wildlife remains powerful because it is not staged but unfolding on its own terms in the frame. A tortoise crossing dry ground, an iguana on black rock, a seabird above empty water, each one is evidence. They show what happens when Ecuador's compression leaves the mainland entirely and becomes isolation. And despite that sense of isolation, it's still tied to the mainland by a narrow strip of land, with water stretching out on both sides. Decisions made in Quito, Guayaquil and small island towns shape what can happen here, from policy on the mainland to rules enforced at the docks. The Pacific coast was the final mainland world. The Galápagos are the coast extended beyond sight. On a flat map, the islands can seem like a distant add-on, scattered off the mainland's edge, almost detached from the rest of the country. In the story of Ecuador, they are the most extreme proof. The country that changed with altitude now changes with distance, as one landscape gives way to another across surprisingly short spans. The volcanic spine becomes offshore rock. The rivers and ports become supply lines. The coast becomes open ocean. And instead of feeling isolated, the famous islands seem to draw closer together across the water. Seen last, the Galapagos do not replace the mainland. They reveal why the mainland was necessary all along. The Galapagos are not the whole story of Ecuador. They complete the map, stretching the country's reach far into the Pacific. Ecuador's outline has not changed. What changed is what you now see inside that small shape. The same outline now carries thin air, volcanic soil, river routes, humid ports, and offshore isolation in one national frame. At the beginning, a flat map made Ecuador look simple. By the end, it has become a kind of cross-section. The Andes are no longer background scenery. They are the first rule, lifting cities into cold equatorial air. Quito matters because it broke the first assumption. The equator here can feel like altitude long before it feels tropical. Then the volcanoes changed the story again. Their slopes did not just decorate the horizon, they organised life below it. Farms, roads, water and risk gathered around those peaks, turning beauty into a working system. In the markets, geography became human. Otavalo was not a colourful interruption. It was trade shaped by elevation and history. Textiles, produce and movement through highland towns showed that identity is not separate from terrain or daily economy. Then the road descended, and Ecuador changed texture without leaving the same national outline. Cloud forest became the hinge, not mountain, not lowland, but the moist middle where categories begin to blur. That middle world mattered because it showed how quickly climate can rewrite the country, sometimes within a short journey. Below it, the Amazon replaced the logic of altitude with the logic of water and current. Rivers did what roads could not. They connected communities, carried supplies, and made distance feel different from the highlands. This was still Ecuador, but the operating system of daily life had changed completely. Then the Pacific coast corrected another blind spot. Ecuador is not only Andes, Amazon and islands. Humidity, fishing, ports, seafood and city scale gave the country a rhythm many outsiders rarely place in Ecuador. The coast made the map wider in feeling, even before the story moved offshore into open ocean. And then the Galápagos arrived, not as the beginning of Ecuador's story but as the final proof. Their distance showed that Ecuador's national reach does not stop where the mainland ends. Their isolation made the earlier chapters feel necessary. Volcanoes, currents, governance, livelihoods, and conservation pressure all converged there. This is why the country resists a simple summary. Variety is not decoration here, it is structure. Altitude decides weather, volcanoes shape soil and risk, rivers decide movement, the coast opens trade, food and another identity. The equator gave Ecuador its name, but not its character. The land, the water and the distance did that. And the land works vertically as much as horizontally, stacking different worlds into one political and cultural frame. Look again at the map, and with its lines and borders in view, the old image no longer works as the main explanation. It is not a small country that happens to contain contrast. It is contrast compressed into a country. That compression shapes ordinary choices, where people farm, how goods move, what cities feel like, and how regions imagine themselves. A mountain morning, a river journey, a coastal market, and a lava shoreline are not separate postcards from one trip. They are linked consequences of elevation, moisture, geology, distance, and national history. The lesson is not that Ecuador is hard to define, it is that the flat definition was always too thin. The map did not exactly lie, it simply left out the third dimension that makes the country legible. Once that dimension appears, Ecuador becomes larger in your mind without changing size on the page. And if one small country can hold this many stacked worlds, what else are we reading too quickly on a map?